So what I'm going to do here is look at Russian state media, Pravda, RT, and TASS. And we're going to look at these articles and we're going to try to understand why they're saying what they're saying and what they're hoping to affect and what's really happening. Now, before I do, it's important to understand it's not both sidesing to say, this is what they're saying, and here's why they're saying it. I'm not saying that this is equal time or anything like that. That's silly. And I'm not platforming when I'm doing this. I'm showing you what they're saying and why in order to help inoculate you to the lies. So that's not platforming and just saying, here, see, isn't this great? I'm not doing that. So with that being said, as caveats, let's look at this. Russian General Staff announces possible date of special military operation. The special military operation will complete in 2024, with the Russian forces defeating the armed forces of Ukraine completely, Deputy Head of the main military political directorate of the General Staff tells TASS. Huh? Okay. Russia was preparing for a decisive battle. He promised to do everything to ensure that the military operation ends in 2024. Now, the first thing that you want to see here is it's completely made up. There's not grounded in reality, and some of these articles are just articles for the sake of being articles. Like, there was like 3 paragraphs here and nothing useful. Okay, that's one kind of article. Here's another article. This was the same day. Putin says Americans will get rid of Zelensky in about a year. Now, sometimes the articles are contradictory. So the first one was saying that the war will wrap up in 2024, and then the next, Putin is saying that's going to take a year to get to. Okay, watch. Russian President Vladimir Putin said that Americans would get rid of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in about a year after he fulfills a number of their demands. Okay, part of the propaganda is that Ukraine is just a pawn of the United States doing America's bidding, not that Russia invaded Ukraine and then America was actually trying to supply it with weapons so that it could defend itself. Kyiv will first be forced to lower mobilization age to 18 years. Then they will get rid of Zelensky. All of this must be done first because this is not an easy task. The law must be adopted and certain steps must be taken. We are now in June 2024. To do all this, it seems to me, one needs a year. Until spring, until the beginning of at least next year, they will tolerate him, and when he does everything, they will say, goodbye, Putin said. Okay, the United States is only interested in its own greatness and cares little about the fate of Kyiv. According to him, the United States under no circumstance wants Russia to be able to achieve any success because this would undermine American leadership in the world. That's another big talking point for the Russians, that, you know, the U.S. is just envious or trying to take Russia down a notch, or they really just want to destroy Russia. But we weren't really thinking about you a whole lot until, like, you're worried about what we're thinking about you. We weren't really thinking about you until you invaded Ukraine. Washington provoked the seizure of power in Ukraine through unconstitutional means. Here we go again, another talking point. The first step toward conflict in Ukraine was taken by those who encouraged the coup in 2014, and Moscow was not to blame for this, Putin said. There was not a coup. That's the way that the Russians tried to frame it. It was the people of Ukraine rising up and protesting against the president's actions. Putin was trying to kind of deal with that president, and the people did not want that. And by the way, he left and fled to Russia. That's not a coup. Okay. So meanwhile, and I showed this 2 days ago, the escort service price in St. Petersburg for the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum is up to about $34,000 per week, and the going rate is about $7,800 for a full day, but girls from other cities can reduce prices. They're not so cosmopolitan to only 350,000 rubles from 700,000 rubles, so you can get a bargain. This is what was carried in Pravda. Not making it up. I showed it 2 days ago as well. Okay, at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, we see world-class journalists like Jackson Hinkle. He's not a world-class journalist, but he is a propagandist who has never seen a Russian talking point he doesn't like, who says that Washington is wasting money on foreign policy blunders like Ukraine, a Russian talking point. The political commentator was one of the guests for a discussion panel on the U.S. information warfare against Russia. Seriously, in this information warfare page in RT, they're talking about information warfare against Russia. It's really, it's mind-numbing how like weird mirror image this is. He says the U.S. is antagonizing the rest of the world with its foreign policy. As Washington loses its clout, Americans face economic degradation and misery. He said, unipolarity cannot exist. You cannot have 1% of the world that stands on the neck of 99% of the world and expect that to continue. That's not what's happening. The 5% that is the United States, which generates about 20 to 25%, somewhere in that range, of gross domestic product, is not standing on the neck of the rest of the world. In fact, it's freeing the rest of the world in order to be able to have international rules that allow them to buy and sell and trade in a free, legitimate way. Other speakers at the event included Minister Karen Knissel. I talked about her just this morning, and just go back to my daily brief, and then RT contributor Scott Ritter, who was taken off the plane when he tried to fly to Moscow. Okay, then there are some stories that are just, it's almost painful to read because they're just so long and windy and just they go on and on about almost nothing. But here, this just hear this and wonder, like, think about who are they talking about? Leaders who view humanity less than equal in human status are extremely naive about their own nature of being human, lacking moral, spiritual, intellectual, active, balancing the consciousness. Not sure exactly what that meant. They use dynamics of absolutism and aggressive behavior to manipulate the weak and helpless people. Who are they talking about? The Russians or who? Okay. Ironically, human minds with normal consciousness would not pursue tyranny, aggressive behavior, killings, and destruction of other nations, cultures, and civilizations. I mean, who are we talking about? Because it sounds like the Russians are doing those very things. It's the abnormal mind, political power, greed, and hatred with sometimes ethnic supremacy that makes them act irrationally and abnormally worse than wild beasts. Okay. Who are they talking about? Biden in a U.S. presidential election year, and Netanyahu, for his own political survival, appear to be competing for glory and success by using wrong thinking and wrong methods and wrong reasons. And we must stop the crimes against humanity by America and Israel. Wait a minute. Who's doing the invading other, pursuing tyranny, aggressive behavior, killing and destruction of nations, cultures, and civilizations right now? It's Russia. But again, this is smoke and mirrors, and this is in Pravda.ru. RT, NATO expansionism hasn't made Europe more secure, according to the Kremlin. The waves of NATO expansionism eastward have not made Europe a safer place, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said on the sidelines of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. NATO, and thus the U.S., started taking steps toward Ukraine, toward our borders, and that became a question of our security. Well, that is possible, except it's not, because Russia knows that NATO would not accept them, and I'll talk about this in my 3 big stories tonight. NATO will not accept them while there is a conflict within their borders. So since 2014, this has been off the table. Kyiv saw Crimea as a territorial issue, he said, after the peninsula rejoined Russia in 2014, following a referendum. However, we have no territorial questions or problems with Finland and Sweden. We have no points of tension or reasons for confrontations. But that's because you didn't seize their territory. If you seized part of their territory since 2014, you might have a problem with them since 2014. NATO, creeping toward the east, has not made the nations of Eastern Europe more secure, rather quite the opposite. Okay, but I think, let's look at this. This is the map of NATO. The darker you are, the older you are within NATO. These were the original countries, including the US and Canada, and then these countries added, and these countries added, and now Finland and Sweden just added. But I would think that if you're in the Baltic states or Poland or one of these former Warsaw Pact countries, that you're feeling a lot safer being in NATO than not being in NATO. Because if you were in these Baltic countries, which the Soviet Union had absorbed at one point, you want to get out of Russia's orbit and under the NATO umbrella. So it is a lot safer. Okay, stop playing with fire on Ukraine, German left-wing icon. Okay, so we have the right wing in the U.S., which is generally the pro-Russian faction, the most MAGA wing, and a little bit on the left, but not as much as the MAGA side. But on either extreme in Europe, it seems to be that's where the pro-Russian faction is. Okay, so Sarah Wagenknecht, tell me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, lashed out at Berlin's decision to allow Kyiv to strike deep into Russia. Wagenknecht made the remarks at a rally in Berlin on Thursday ahead of the European Parliament elections. At the demonstration, the politician supporters carrying banners bearing her face and the words, "War or peace, it's your choice now." But it's really not, because if you take peace on the conditions that the aggressor gets to take the stuff from the victim, that's not really peace. That's slavery for the victim, and that's enticing more aggressors to do more of that same thing. Her party is a party that is left-leaning on economic issues, but closer to the far right on several hot-button issues such as immigration. She urged other Western countries to, quote, stop playing with fire, while repeating calls for peaceful settlement of the conflict. War does not end with weapons. War is ended with peace talks. And we have to end war in Ukraine and not keep escalating it. That's madness. No, what's madness, again, these are all Russian talking points that are being amplified here. What's madness is allowing Russia to get away with doing what they're doing, because they'll just come and do more again later on, or other dictators will try the same thing. Ukraine is fully governed, sponsored by the West, says Dmitry Medvedev, who also said that the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, should repent before Ukrainians for his lies about imminent victory, for devoting Ukrainians to destruction, and for the revival of Nazism. He's talking to the Germans about the revival of Nazism? Are you, what? It's not, there's nothing same about that. If you ask Germans back in 1939, 1942, whatever, and you said, well, where are the Nazis? A bunch of hands would go up in the air. But if you ask Ukrainians where they are, they're like, what Nazis? We don't have Nazis. What are you talking about? Let's look at another story, same thing. German leader is a rotten liverwurst, says Medvedev. Medvedev lashed out at Scholz, who argued that President Vladimir Putin must finally realize that Ukraine is strong and will not be forced to its knees or forced to surrender. Scholz went on to say that there can only be a just peace for Ukraine, adding that working for peace does not mean simply raising the white flag. That's exactly right. Medvedev responded, calling Scholz a rotten liverwurst, who said he unexpectedly became chatty and talked outright drivel. Well, drop the mic. Okay, so where does this strength come from, sausage maker? He really said that, sausage maker. From the exuberant corruption, which is completely out of control, from the wholesale theft of this aid by Zelensky's clique, or from a dying people, half of whom live in Russia and Europe? Medvedev asked. Scholz should get down on his knees and repent before the Ukrainians for lying to them that they could achieve victory against Russia, and for dooming them to the slaughter while sacrificing the well-being of Germans. The German Chancellor should also take responsibility for the revival of Nazism in Ukraine. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. This is what RT is putting out. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. Here's TASS. Former U.S. presidential contender says Washington seeks regime change in Russia. This is a very popular talking point in the Russian press. So they're amplifying Vivek Ramaswamy because he's saying something that lines up with what they are putting out there regularly. Listen carefully to Biden and the bipartisan warmonger caucus on Ukraine. It's no longer just about defending Ukraine. These lunatics are starting to sound like they want full-on offense on Russia. It's lunacy, Ramaswamy wrote on the X social network. The reason that they never stated the war aim in Ukraine is that they wanted the flexibility to move the goalpost. They're going for what they've wanted all along, regime change in Russia, without thinking twice about the consequences. And again, they're echoing him because it's a popular talking point in Russia. Okay, Maria Zakharova says that Western hegemony is over. Russia intends to fight for a new polycentric word. This is the first time I've seen the term polycentric. Usually they use the term multipolar. The concepts of hegemony and global dominance, which the collective West clings to, have no place in the multipolar world, Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said on Saturday. We are talking about polycentrism. So poly is multiple or a number of, and then centrism is multiple centers. Okay, so that's a departure from previous norms. What they really want is kind of a bipolar world where the US is on one side and kind of Russia, China is on the other side, kind of like the old former Soviet days. But they're willing to have multiple points if it just takes the US and the West dominance down a bit. We are talking about polycentrism, a departure from previous norms, and we see the desperate resistance of the collective West. They see the norm differently, as their own dominance, as a world order based on one rule, that they must dominate as before, and everyone must only do what the dominant allow them to do. That's not it at all. That's the talking points coming from Russian state media, but that's not it. It's nobody in the West thinks, we need to hang on to our hegemony. They're just thinking like, violating this international order is bad because other things are going to happen, and then we'll have jungle survival of the fittest kind of might makes right, and we don't want that. Okay. Ukrainian soldiers hooked on energy drinks, according to the New York Times. Again, this is an RT. How terrible is that? They drink energy drinks. Some service members are unable to cope with the workload on the front line without a liquid jolt. Well, it's not vodka, so, that's a step forward. But in the morning, when I wake up, I drink an energy drink. When I head out on patrol, I drink an energy drink. Before an attack, I drink an energy drink. One reconnaissance soldier told the New York Times. He explained that without energy drinks, he would not be able to walk distances of up to 7 kilometers while carrying 40 kilograms of gear and being largely deprived of sleep and food for 3 days. Dude, I know people that I work with that need this in order to, mark papers. This is not but it's such a scandal that they need an energy drink. Okay, last article here. Peace in Ukraine depends on the EU and US elections. Hungarian Prime Minister. And this is really important. Answering the questions of TASS correspondent, when peace in Ukraine can be expected, Orban said it can be achieved in 2 steps. He explained that the main topic of the ongoing European Parliament elections in all EU countries is the issue of war and peace. In November, the Prime Minister recalled the US presidential election will take place. This is the second step, Orban pointed out. He emphasized that if the elections in Europe and the US are won by peace-loving people, then the peace can be established in Ukraine. Now, our first task is to win the elections to the European Parliament. But what he means by peace is not what I mean by peace. He means that Russia wins and Ukraine has to make a deal with the aggressor in order to say, stop, please stop, and you can take all the land. Now, what I mean by peace is that Ukraine wins, that they push Russians out and they take their land back and they can live harmoniously under the umbrella of NATO. 2 very different definitions of peace. Okay, that is what you'll be exposed to when you're looking at the world of TASS and Pravda and RT and other Russian state media. It's important that you understand what they're saying and why they're saying it. If you have any questions below, please put that in the comments. Thank you for the time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, and the subscribes. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.